The strangest thing about losing my husband wasn't the crying, it was the silence. People think grief arrives like a storm. They imagine loud sobbing, shaking hands, and endless tears falling onto pillows late at night. But no one tells you that grief can arrive quietly. No one tells you that sometimes it simply sits beside you and waits. After 43 years of marriage, silence suddenly had a sound. It sat across from me at the breakfast table where Thomas used to complain that I burned the toast. It followed me through the hallway where his footsteps used to meet mine every evening at 6:30 sharp. It slept beside me in our bed, cold and still. I am Margaret Whitmore, and I was 70 years old when my husband died. I think some part of me left with him that day. The morning after the funeral, I woke up at exactly 6:15, the same time I had awakened for almost 4 decades. I walked downstairs without thinking and put on a pot of coffee, 2 cups. I made 2 cups. I stared at them sitting there on the kitchen counter while steam rose softly into the air. Mine and his. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for the coffee to grow cold. Long enough to realize that some habits become part of your bones. I slowly picked up his cup and poured it into the sink. My hands shook so badly, I had to hold on to the counter. The house felt different after Thomas was gone. Not empty. Empty would have been easier. It felt paused, as if the walls themselves were waiting for him to come home. His reading glasses still rested on the little table beside his chair in the living room. His favorite gray sweater still hung behind our bedroom door. His slippers sat neatly beside the bed. I couldn't move any of it. People told me I should. Margaret, it'll help you heal. I smiled and nodded politely. But they didn't understand. Moving his things felt like erasing proof that he had existed. For weeks after the funeral, the house stayed busy. Neighbors brought casseroles and pies. Friends visited and spoke softly, as if loud voices might break me apart. They hugged me tightly. They said kind things. Thomas was such a wonderful man. You two had a beautiful life. If you need anything, call. People say beautiful things when grief is fresh. Then slowly, carefully, life calls them back. Visits became shorter. Phone calls became fewer. The flowers began to wilt. One by one, everyone returned to their lives. I sat by the living room window most evenings and watched the sun disappear behind our backyard fence. That was where Thomas used to sit with me, every evening. No matter how busy work had been, he would bring out 2 cups of tea and say, "Sit down, Maggie. The world can wait 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Funny how the smallest moments become the ones you miss the most. I wasn't completely alone, though. I still had my son Daniel, my daughter-in-law Rebecca, and my grandson Ethan. At least that was what I kept telling myself. Rebecca called almost every day after the funeral. "Margaret, are you eating? Margaret, are you sleeping? Margaret, let me help organize things." Her voice sounded warm, caring. I remember sitting in my kitchen one afternoon with the phone pressed against my ear while staring at Thomas's empty chair. I smiled for the first time in days. I thought how lucky I was. I thought family stays when everyone else leaves. I didn't know then that loneliness doesn't always come from an empty house. Sometimes it comes from sitting in a full room and slowly realizing you no longer know the people around you. 3 weeks after Thomas passed away, we gathered for the inheritance meeting. I remember that morning clearly because grief had exhausted me so much that even choosing what to wear felt difficult. I stood in front of my closet, staring at rows of clothes I had owned for years. My fingers moved slowly across sweaters and dresses until I stopped at a simple navy blue one Thomas always liked. He used to smile whenever I wore it. "You still look beautiful in blue, Maggie," he would say. I sat on the edge of the bed afterward and held his photograph from my nightstand. His picture had been taken years ago during a summer vacation near the lake. He was laughing at something I had said. I touched the frame gently. "You always understood people better than I did," I whispered. For some reason, my chest suddenly felt heavy, not with grief alone, with something else, something I couldn't explain. The meeting was held in the conference room at our company building. Walking through those doors felt strange. Thomas and I had spent nearly our entire adult lives there. I still remembered carrying boxes into our first tiny office when we could barely afford furniture. I remembered eating sandwiches at our desks because we couldn't afford restaurants. I remembered sitting beside him late at night, both of us too tired to speak. That company wasn't numbers on paper, it wasn't property, it wasn't money. It was our life folded into walls and floors. When I entered the conference room, Daniel stood up immediately. "Mom." He hugged me tightly. For a moment, I felt relieved. My son still felt like my little boy. Still felt safe. Rebecca sat across the table beside Ethan. She wore a cream-colored suit and had a folder neatly placed in front of her. She smiled when she saw me. But something about it felt different. I couldn't explain why. Have you ever looked at someone you've known for years and suddenly felt a quiet distance standing between you? Like noticing a crack in a window that had always been there but somehow escaped your eyes? That morning felt like that. "Margaret, sit here," Rebecca said sweetly. She pulled out the chair beside her. I thanked her and sat down. For a while, everything seemed normal. Small talk filled the room. Daniel asked whether I had been sleeping better. Ethan looked down at his phone and barely spoke. Rebecca poured me tea. She smiled often. Very often. Then I noticed something strange. Whenever the company was mentioned, Rebecca became unusually attentive. Her eyes sharpened. Not visibly enough for anyone else to notice. Just enough. Little things reveal people. Thomas used to tell me that. Don't listen only to words, Maggie. Watch pauses, watch eyes, watch silence. At the time, I thought he was simply observant. Now his voice returned to me. The lawyer had not arrived yet, so we sat waiting. Rebecca crossed her legs slowly and looked around the room. Then she leaned back in her chair. And she smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, coldly. It lasted only a moment, just a few seconds, but I felt something inside me grow still. Then she looked directly at me and said quietly, "Well, now that the old man is gone, things will have to move forward." Old man. Not Thomas, not your husband, not Ethan's grandfather. Just the old man. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. And for the first time since Thomas died, I felt something worse than grief. I felt alone. The room felt unusually small after Rebecca spoke. No one said anything at first. Silence has different meanings in life. Sometimes silence is peace. Sometimes it is grief. And sometimes silence is the moment your heart begins noticing what your mind has been trying not to see. I lowered my eyes to my hands, resting in my lap. At 70 years old, I had learned something about pain. The sharpest kind rarely arrives with shouting. It comes quietly. It sits beside you and changes the air in the room. Rebecca straightened a few papers in front of her and smiled again. "Margaret," she said gently, "you've been through enough already." Her voice sounded soft, caring. But suddenly I heard something underneath it. Not kindness, control. "You shouldn't worry yourself with business matters anymore," she continued. "You've worked hard your whole life. You deserve rest." I nodded slowly. Not because I agreed, because I was listening. Really listening. Thomas used to say that people often reveal themselves when they think you've stopped paying attention. I looked toward Daniel. My son sat unusually still beside his wife. He wasn't looking at me. He wasn't looking at anyone. He kept staring at the table. I felt a quiet ache inside my chest, because mothers notice things. We notice when our children laugh differently, when their eyes look tired, when something sits heavily inside them, even when they say nothing. "Rebecca," Daniel finally said softly. But then he stopped. Just stopped. She placed her hand over his and squeezed it. And somehow, that small movement felt less like comfort and more like a warning. Then the door opened. My lawyer walked inside carrying a thin black folder. His name was Michael Harper. Thomas had trusted him for nearly 20 years. Michael greeted everyone politely before taking his seat. He looked at me first. Not for long. Just long enough. and I noticed something in his eyes. Carefulness, as if he had spent the entire drive wondering how to say difficult words gently. My stomach tightened. He opened the folder slowly. Paper slid quietly across the table. No one spoke. Even Ethan had finally looked up from his phone. Michael cleared his throat. "Before discussing Thomas's estate and company arrangements," he said carefully, "there is one matter Mr. Whitmore instructed me to address first." Rebecca's smile faded slightly. Only slightly. I noticed. Mothers and wives spend their lives noticing tiny changes. Thomas had requested several documents remain sealed until after his passing. Michael paused, then looked down. His voice became softer. Included among these documents was a DNA test. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Rebecca blinked. Daniel looked confused. I felt my heartbeat slow instead of quicken. Because suddenly I remembered something. 6 months before Thomas died, he had sat quietly beside me in our garden. He had looked tired, older. He held my hand and said, "Maggie, sometimes people discover truths they never expected." I had asked him what he meant. He smiled sadly and changed the subject. At the time, I let it go. Marriage teaches you that some conversations arrive later. Now I felt cold. Michael looked down again. His fingers tightened around the paper. Then he read the words aloud. "DNA analysis confirms there is no biological relationship between Ethan Whitmore and Daniel Whitmore." The room stopped. Completely stopped. No one moved. No one breathed. Across the table, Rebecca's face had gone pale. And beside me, for the first time that day, I heard my son quietly break. People imagine that truth arrives like thunder. They imagine shouting, tears, doors slamming, and dramatic endings. But that isn't what happened. Truth entered our lives quietly, and then it simply sat there. No one spoke for several seconds after Michael finished reading. The room looked exactly the same. The same chairs, the same table, the same afternoon sunlight reaching across the carpet. And yet nothing was the same anymore. Daniel stared ahead as if he had forgotten where he was. Rebecca's face had lost all color. Ethan looked back and forth between his parents with frightened eyes, confused by a pain he couldn't yet understand. And I sat there thinking about my husband, not the company, not the inheritance, Thomas. I suddenly understood the sadness I had seen in him months earlier in our garden, the quiet distance in his eyes, the way he had begun watching people instead of speaking. He knew, or at least he suspected. And somehow, even carrying that burden, he chose kindness over anger. My eyes filled with tears. Not because of betrayal, because I realized how lonely he must have felt. I wanted to reach across time and hold his hand. I wanted to tell him he didn't have to carry everything alone. Daniel finally spoke. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "How long?" Rebecca closed her eyes. No one answered immediately. And for the first time since I had known her, I saw something different in her face. Not confidence, not control. Fear. Real fear. But strangely, I felt no satisfaction. I felt tired. Because pain inside a family never creates winners. It only changes who hurts. The weeks afterward were quiet. Very quiet. Daniel moved into a small apartment for some time. Ethan struggled to understand why his world suddenly felt unstable. Rebecca stopped calling. There were meetings with lawyers and difficult conversations and long stretches of silence. But I discovered something surprising during those months. I discovered that grief and betrayal are different kinds of pain. Grief is losing someone who loved you. Betrayal is losing someone you thought loved you. One leaves emptiness. The other leaves questions. For a while, I kept asking myself whether I should become angry, whether I should fight, whether I should make someone pay for the hurt that entered our family. But every time I sat with those thoughts, I heard Thomas's voice. "Maggie, peace isn't weakness." So I made decisions quietly. The company remained protected exactly as Thomas wished. Professional management took over while Daniel stepped away to heal and think about his future. I also created educational trusts for Ethan. Not because of blood, because of love. Because no child should carry the weight of adult mistakes. Months later, Ethan visited me one Sunday afternoon. We sat together in the backyard garden Thomas loved so much. The roses had begun blooming again. Ethan looked down at his hands and asked softly, "Grandma, do you still love me?" Children ask questions adults are too afraid to ask. I looked at him and saw the little boy who used to run through office hallways, who used to steal cookies from my kitchen and fall asleep beside me during movies. I smiled. Then I touched his cheek gently. "Ethan," I said, "love is not a last name." His eyes filled with tears, and so did mine. Now I sit in that garden almost every evening, just like Thomas and I used to. The world still moves too fast. People still disappoint each other. Life still breaks hearts. But I finally learned something sitting here alone. Boundaries are not walls built from anger. They are doors built from self-respect. And peace doesn't come from holding on to people who hurt you. Sometimes peace arrives when you quietly let go and keep your dignity. Then at last you sit in the garden and feel the sunlight again.